Putin has realized that withdrawing from the grain deal was probably not to Moscow's advantage and is now trying to leverage what he can over out of a renewal of this deal.
Now, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been meeting President Putin in the Russian resort of Sochi to try to revive the critical Black Sea grain deal that allowed Ukraine to export some of its supplies but was abandoned by Putin in July. The two leaders were seen smiling and shaking hands as Erdogan arrived at Putin's residence, and the Russian president suggested he should take a holiday in the Black Sea resort. Well, afterwards, Erdogan suggested a deal to resume grain shipments could be reached. Earlier, I spoke to Michael Binyon, Times leader writer, columnist, and a former foreign correspondent who told me more about the talks.
They met in Sochi and they discussed in particular the grain deal that Turkey helped to broker about a year ago, under which the Russians would not stop Ukraine exporting a large amount of grain on ships from the Black Sea, which, of course, they had threatened to destroy. The Russians pulled out of that deal in July, saying that it wasn't fair because the Russians were being blockaded from their food and fertilizer exports. And, of course, this is a really worrying thing for Africa and much of the developing world because they rely very heavily on grain from Ukraine.
And of course, it's been a huge problem for Ukraine as well because it's ended up with thousands of tons of grain stuck in its warehouses.
Exactly. And of course, they were targets. I mean, if the Russians wanted to be particularly vengeful, they could destroy this grain and not only cut off all the income from Ukraine, but demoralize and really destroy the livelihoods of all the farmers who harvested it.
What do we know then about how far they reached in these talks, Presidents Putin and Erdogan?
Well, I think they've got quite far. I mean, it's quite obvious that Erdogan was sort of pushing at an open door because when Putin said he wasn't going to continue to observe this deal after July, he was really deluged with complaints and worries from Africa. And he's just held a big summit in St. Petersburg with a number of senior African leaders, all of whom said that they need the grain. And it's a face-saving way for him to try to get back into the deal. In fact, a Ukrainian ship, I think it was Ukrainian, or certainly a ship, did take a large consignment of grain from Ukraine for export markets only recently. And the Russians didn't attempt to hit it or target it. So I think they're sort of turning a blind eye to it. But now Erdogan wants to win another kind of political triumph to show that he had brokered a renewal of this deal.
And it would be significant, wouldn't it, if there could be a breakthrough here, because we've seen a real escalation of tension in the Black Sea, attacks on those Ukrainian grain stores and attacks on Russian shipping as well.
Yes, it would certainly defuse things to a certain extent. I don't think that it will make it much easier for the Ukrainians, apart from the grain exports, because the Russians are still determined to bombard targets from the Black Sea. But it is important. I mean, the grain is a huge money spinner for Ukraine. It's vital to their economy, and it's vital to very many countries in Africa particularly. Now, the Russians want something back in return. I mean, there isn't a complete deal yet, because Putin said after they spoke that he wants the West to remove sanctions, he said, that are blocking Russian food exports. Well, that's not quite true. There's no blockade on Russian food or fertilizer exports, but there are financial sanctions on Russia, which means that it's quite difficult for the Russians to get paid for these exports that they send also to Africa. So what Putin is trying to leverage is that the Russians would be allowed to rejoin the SWIFT, as they call it, the SWIFT payment system for all their agricultural exports.
But presumably the UK, the United States and many of its allies would be absolutely opposed to any easing of those financial sanctions against Russia at the moment.
Well, that's a big problem. Yes, they would, because, of course, it could be the thin end of the wedge, and it could mean that Russia's then to use that to get paid for all sorts of other exports. But the problem is that Britain and the US and most Western countries would like to see the grain deal reinstated. I mean, they're supporting Ukraine, which is desperate to sell its grain. And this was one very small glimmer of hope that there might be some kind of negotiations over the whole future of the war, I mean, over what's going on. And so the UN and the Western countries would like this deal to go ahead. Turkey is a NATO member, and it's interesting that it's a NATO member that is proposing this deal. And so the West has got to think up some way that they could arrange payment for the Russians to export their food and their fertilizer without breaking all the other international financial sanctions.
It is fascinating that President Erdogan, who, as you say, leads a NATO country, is meeting face to face with Putin, clearly maintaining quite significant links with the Russian leader. How significant a role do you think he is playing at the moment on the international stage? Because clearly many other NATO allies are implacably opposed to the war and implacably opposed to what Russia is doing.
Indeed, and this has been something of a problem both for NATO and for Turkey. NATO is very much upset that Turkey never joined in the original sanctions on Russia. And in fact, Turkey is doing pretty well out of the present situation because the Russians can't pay for anything directly from the West, but they can pay money to Turkey. And in fact, they can travel there freely. And in fact, relations with Turkey are still more or less normal. So for the Russians, it's an absolutely vital kind of loophole to get through or get around many Western sanctions. Now, the West has been urging Turkey to tighten up ever since the Russian invasion. But it doesn't look as though Erdogan has any intention of doing that. And he's playing a bit of a double game. He's in NATO, he supports NATO, but at the same time, he's really also showing himself to be, pretty flexible towards the Russian side. And I think he thinks that he can position himself as a kind of intermediary.
And given that he has brokered this grain deal in the past, which did work to a degree for quite some time, what do you think are the prospects of him brokering a further deal, at least to allow some grain shipments to resume through those Black Sea ports?
Oh, I think that will be possible. I think the Russians themselves want to get back into it. After all, if they were really implacably imposed, they would have hit more Ukrainian grain stores already. They would have hit the ship that did take some grain out after the Russians said they'd withdrawn from the deal. The Russians are under pressure from their African friends to supply the grain and to allow Ukraine to supply the grain. And therefore, they've already promised 6 countries free grain supplies. So they have to allow the grain to get there somehow. And I think Putin has realized that withdrawing from the grain deal was probably not to Moscow's advantage and is now trying to leverage what he can over out of a renewal of this deal.
Let me just ask you finally about the wider shape of this war. There had been huge amounts of hope and expectations on the Ukrainian side and many of its allies about that offensive, which did begin a month or two back. We're hearing about some breakthroughs, but they don't seem to have been hugely significant. What's your assessment of how this war is shaping up?
Well, it's becoming a bit of a stalemate, to be honest. The front lines have hardly changed at all in the past year or so. A little bit of gain for Ukraine here, a little bit of pushback by the Russians there. The fact is, though, it's much more difficult to launch an offensive than it is to defend territory that you've got. So the Russians have been digging in very, very carefully and skillfully all along the long line that is now the front line with Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are finding it very hard to break through. They don't have the armor. They don't have the jet fighters that they need. They don't have some of the weapons. They are losing quite a lot of casualties, and it's not really going very well. It's not yet a failure, but it's certainly not the big breakthrough many in Kiev were hoping for.
Michael Binyon, Times leader writer and former foreign correspondent, speaking to me a little earlier about those fascinating talks between Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and President Putin of Russia.